It was almost midnight at the small town hospital. The hallways were quiet, with only the soft hum of machines and the faint sound of rain tapping against the windows. Most of the staff had gone home, but one nurse was still there, finishing her shift. Her white shoes were worn out and her eyes looked tired, but she still moved with gentle care as she checked on the last patient in the ward. She had been working for more than 12 hours straight, but she didn't complain. She couldn't afford to. The hospital didn't pay much, and she needed every extra hour she could get. Her father was sick at home, and the bills kept piling up. Every month it was a struggle to decide which bill to pay first. Some nights she skipped dinner so her father could have medicine. Still, she never let her problems show when she was with patients. Her kindness was what made people trust her. That night, after finishing her round, she stepped outside to breathe for a moment. The rain had turned heavier, and the streets were almost empty. The hospital lights glowed softly through the mist. She hugged her thin jacket closer and was about to go back inside when she noticed someone sitting near the gate. He looked like a shadow at first, curled up against the cold wall. When she walked closer, she saw a man in torn clothes soaking wet from the rain. His shoes were full of holes and his hands were trembling. He didn't look dangerous, just lost and hungry. Most people would have walked past him, pretending not to see, but she couldn't. Something about the way he sat there made her heart ache. "Sir, are you all right?" she asked softly. The man lifted his head slowly. His beard was messy, his eyes tired, but there was something gentle in them. He looked embarrassed, as if being seen like this hurt him more than the cold. "I'm fine," he murmured. "Just resting for a while." "You're drenched," she said. "You'll get sick if you stay out here." He tried to smile. "I'll be okay. Thank you." She could hear the hunger in his weak voice. She looked around. The night guard was asleep inside and no one else was around. Without thinking twice, she opened her bag and took out the sandwich she had saved for later. It was supposed to be her dinner, but she knelt and handed it to him. "Please eat this," she said. "You look like you haven't eaten in days." He stared at the food for a moment, unsure whether to accept it. "I can't take your food," he whispered. "You can," she said kindly. "It's just a sandwich." He hesitated, then took it with shaking hands. He ate slowly, like someone who hadn't eaten properly in a long time. She stood nearby, watching quietly. The rain kept falling, the wind cold against her face, but she didn't leave. When he finished, he thanked her softly. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "I'm used to people pretending I don't exist." She smiled faintly. "No one deserves to be treated like that. We all need help sometimes." For a long moment, neither spoke. The sound of rain filled the silence between them. Then she said, "Come inside. You can stay in the waiting area until the rain stops. It's warmer there." He looked surprised. "You'd let me in?" "Of course," she replied. "You'll catch pneumonia out here." He followed her quietly. She gave him an old blanket from the storage room and brought him a cup of tea from the hospital kitchen. He sat in the corner of the waiting room, still looking uncertain, as if afraid someone would throw him out. She could tell he wasn't used to kindness. As she worked through her remaining tasks that night, she checked on him a few times. He was sitting quietly, drinking the tea slowly, watching the rain through the glass doors. Before she left her shift, she went up to him again. "You can rest here till morning," she said. "I'll talk to the morning staff so they don't make you leave." He nodded, his voice barely a whisper. "Thank you, miss." "You're very kind," she smiled. "Kindness doesn't cost anything. Take care of yourself, all right?" He gave her a small, genuine smile. "I'll remember that." When she walked out into the dawn, her shoes splashed through puddles and her stomach growled from skipping dinner. But inside she felt something peaceful. She didn't know who that man was, and she didn't expect to see him again. She only knew she had done what her heart told her was right. The next few days passed like any other. The nurse continued her long shifts, moving from one patient to another, barely having time to eat or rest. She never mentioned the man she helped that night to anyone. For her, it wasn't a big story. It was just another act of kindness, something small she could do in a world that often forgot to care. But for the man she helped, it was something unforgettable. He had not been lying when he said he was fine, at least not in the usual sense. He was not a poor man. In fact, he was far from it. He was one of the wealthiest businessmen in the city, the owner of several companies that made headlines often. Yet under all that wealth, he had been feeling empty for a long time. He had grown tired of people pretending to care just because of his money. Every smile around him felt rehearsed. Every handshake came with a motive. He had lost faith in people, so one day he walked away from it all. He left his mansion, his expensive suits, his cars, and went out dressed as an ordinary man with nothing. He wanted to see how the world treated someone who couldn't give them anything in return. And that's when he met her. The nurse who didn't ask his name, didn't question where he came from, didn't look down on him. She saw him as a human being, not a burden. That one act of kindness stayed in his heart like a light in the dark. Back at the hospital, the nurse's days continued to be hard. Some nights she cried quietly when no one could see. She worried about her father's health and how she'd pay the next round of bills. Sometimes when she was tired, she'd remember that man's grateful smile, and somehow it gave her strength. It reminded her that kindness mattered, even when life felt unfair. One rainy evening, a week after that night, she passed by the same gate again. She looked around, half expecting to see the man sitting there, but he was gone. She hoped he had found somewhere better to stay. She whispered a small prayer for him before heading back inside. What she didn't know was that the man had been searching for her name ever since he left the hospital. He wanted to know who she was, the woman who helped him when he had nothing. He asked quietly around the town, sent people to look into the small hospital. It took him some time, but he found her name and her story. He learned about her father's illness, her debt, and the way she never stopped caring for others even when she had so little herself. The man couldn't believe such people still existed in a world where most cared only for themselves. He realized she had given him something he couldn't buy, faith in goodness again. Meanwhile, she kept living her quiet, simple life. Every morning she took the bus to the hospital, sometimes eating only a piece of bread before work. Her co-workers liked her but often worried about her health. "You work too much," they told her. She just smiled and said, "I'll rest when things get better." One night, after a particularly long shift, she sat alone in the hospital cafeteria. Her body ached, her head throbbed, and her heart felt heavy. She had just received another notice for unpaid rent. She sighed, resting her face in her hands when she heard the sound of rain again outside. For some reason, she thought of that man in rags. She wondered where he was now, if he had found shelter or food. The thought brought a small smile to her tired face. "I hope he's all right," she whispered. She didn't know that far away, in a tall building filled with glass and lights, the same man was sitting in his office, staring out at the same rain. In his mind, he could still see the nurse's kind eyes and hear her voice telling him, "The world still has good days ahead." He smiled quietly to himself. He knew what he wanted to do. That night, as the rain poured down on both of them, two very different lives were quietly moving toward each other again, one filled with struggle and hope, and the other with wealth and longing for something real. Neither of them knew yet how their paths would cross again, but fate was already at work, and it all began with a simple act of kindness on a rainy night. The rain had stopped by the time the sun rose over the city. The tall glass buildings glimmered with drops of water, and the streets were busy again. Inside one of those tall buildings sat the same man the nurse had helped just a week earlier. But now he didn't look anything like the person she had met outside the hospital. His face was clean-shaven, his hair neatly styled, and his expensive suit fit him perfectly. His assistant stood outside his office waiting for instructions. Everyone knew him as a powerful man, someone who didn't like to waste time. Yet this morning he wasn't thinking about meetings or profits. He sat in silence by the window watching the world outside. His thoughts kept going back to that small hospital, and the woman who had given him food without asking for anything in return. The look in her eyes had been so genuine, so pure, that he couldn't forget it. He had met thousands of people in his life, businessmen, politicians, celebrities, but none of them had looked at him the way she did that night. They all saw his wealth first. She saw a human being. He remembered the way she spoke softly, the way she smiled even when she was tired. He remembered how she gave him her only sandwich without hesitation. It wasn't just the food. It was the care behind it that touched him deeply. For years, he had been surrounded by people who wanted something from him. Money, favors, influence, no one stayed just for who he was. He had started to believe kindness no longer existed in the world. But that night, under the rain, a nurse with tired eyes reminded him it still did. He leaned back in his chair and sighed. The people who worked with him wouldn't understand what he was feeling. They only knew the successful version of him, the man who built an empire from nothing. None of them knew how lonely success had made him. He called his personal assistant and said, "Cancel my afternoon meetings." The assistant looked surprised. "All of them, sir?" "Yes, all of them." He needed time to think. He needed to understand why that simple moment at the hospital had changed something inside him. Later that day, he drove out of the city in his black car. His driver looked confused but didn't ask questions. The man told him to stop near the small-town hospital. He sat in the car for a while, watching the entrance. People came and went, patients, doctors, nurses, but he didn't see her. After a few minutes, he asked the driver to wait and went inside. The receptionist looked up and greeted him politely, not recognizing who he was. He asked casually, "There was a nurse who worked the night shift last week. She's about this tall, dark hair, kind smile. Do you know her?" The receptionist smiled. "That sounds like her. She's one of the most hardworking people here, but she's off today. She usually works double shifts." "Double shifts?" he repeated quietly. "Yes, she's taking care of her father, I think," the receptionist said. "She never complains, though, always smiling." He thanked her and walked back to the car, deep in thought. The world seemed unfair to him in that moment. How could someone so selfless have so little? And how could so many people with everything be so cold-hearted? That night, he couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about her. He wasn't sure what he wanted to do yet, but he knew he couldn't forget her. Over the next few days, he quietly gathered information about her. He didn't want to invade her privacy. He only wanted to understand her life better. He learned that she rented a small room near the hospital, lived alone with her father, and spent most of her time working. Her salary was barely enough to cover the bills. Yet she still managed to help others whenever she could. He also found out that the hospital was struggling financially. The equipment was old, some machines didn't work properly, and the staff were underpaid. That explained why she worked so many hours. He made a decision. The next morning, he called his financial team and said, "I want to make a donation to a hospital." They asked which one. He gave them the name of her hospital but told them to keep his identity anonymous. "No publicity," he said firmly. "I don't want my name attached to it." Within a week, the hospital received a large sum of money. The management was shocked but grateful. They used the donation to fix broken equipment, buy new beds, and even give a small salary raise to the staff. Everyone wondered who the generous donor was, but no one knew. The nurse found out about it when she came to work. Her co-workers were overjoyed. "Can you believe it?" one of them said. "Someone donated enough to change everything. We can finally get new oxygen tanks and machines." She smiled, feeling genuinely happy. "That's amazing," she said. Maybe good things still happen after all. She had no idea that the man she once helped was behind it all. Meanwhile, he felt lighter than he had in years. Helping her, helping the hospital, gave him a sense of peace that money had never been able to buy. But still, he wanted to see her again. He didn't know how or when, but he wanted to thank her properly. Not as a stranger in rags, but as himself. One evening, he asked his assistant to prepare a visit to the hospital, pretending it was part of a healthcare foundation project. That way, he could go there without revealing too much at first. When the day came, he dressed in his usual suit but kept his tone humble and polite. As he walked through the hospital halls, people whispered his name in surprise. He was a well-known figure in the business world, but no one expected to see him in a small-town hospital. The nurse was on duty that day. She was in the hallway helping a patient into a wheelchair when she looked up and froze. The man walking toward her looked familiar, but she couldn't quite place where she had seen him. Then he smiled, the same gentle smile from that rainy night, and she remembered. Her eyes widened. "It's you," she whispered. He nodded, a warmth in his gaze. "Yes," he said softly. "It's me," she blinked, confused. "But you look so different," he smiled faintly. "That night I wasn't exactly myself." The people around them didn't understand what was happening, but they could feel the emotion in the air. She didn't know what to say. You were that man outside. The one in the rain." "I was," he admitted. "And you helped me when no one else would." Her lips parted, but no words came out. She felt a mix of shock and disbelief. He looked around the hospital and then back at her. "I came to thank you," he said quietly. "For that night. For your kindness." She shook her head quickly. "You don't have to thank me. Anyone would have done the same. He smiled sadly. No, not anyone. You didn't know who I was. You didn't ask for anything. You just cared. She didn't know how to respond. She could feel her cheeks warm with embarrassment. She had never imagined the man she gave a sandwich to was someone so powerful. Before she could say more, the hospital director approached and introduced him to everyone formally. The staff learned that he had been the anonymous donor, and there was a wave of surprise and gratitude. But she stood quietly in the back, her heart beating fast. After the meeting, he found a quiet moment to speak with her alone near the garden outside the hospital. The evening light made everything calm. I didn't want to make you uncomfortable, he said gently, but I couldn't leave without seeing you again. She smiled nervously. You didn't have to do all this for me. I didn't do it for you alone, he replied. I did it because you reminded me that kindness still exists. That's something I had forgotten. She looked down, unsure what to say. For a moment they stood in silence. The sound of birds filled the air. Then he added softly, I'll always be grateful for that night. She finally looked up at him. I'm just glad you're all right, she said sincerely. You seemed so lost then. He smiled gently. I was, but you helped me find myself again. With that, he took a small step back and said, This won't be the last time we meet. She watched him leave, still trying to process everything that had happened. She couldn't explain why, but her heart felt lighter. Something inside her told her this story wasn't over yet, and she was right. It was only the beginning of something that would soon change both of their lives forever. After that day, the nurse tried to go back to her normal routine, but nothing felt the same. The image of that man standing in the hospital hallway kept replaying in her mind. It felt unreal that the quiet, homeless stranger she had once helped was actually a wealthy businessman. She still couldn't understand why he had come back, or why he had gone to such lengths to help the hospital. She told herself it didn't matter. He had done a good thing and she was grateful for it. But somewhere deep down, a part of her felt something she couldn't explain, something gentle and confusing at the same time. A few days later, she was finishing her shift when the receptionist came running toward her with wide eyes. You won't believe who's here again, she said, whispering. The nurse looked up in surprise. Who? Before the receptionist could answer, she saw him walking down the corridor. He wasn't surrounded by assistants or cameras this time. He was dressed simply, holding a small box in his hand. He looked calmer, almost ordinary, but there was still something about him that made everyone stop and stare. He smiled when he saw her. I hope I'm not disturbing you, he said. She shook her head, still a little nervous. Not at all. You're always welcome here. He handed her the box. It's nothing fancy, he said. Just something for the staff to share. When she opened it, she saw it was full of pastries and fresh fruit. The hospital staff gathered around, excited. It wasn't often that anyone brought them treats. The man stood aside quietly, watching their happy faces. When the others went back to work, the nurse looked at him and smiled softly. You didn't have to do this, she said. You've already done so much for us, he shrugged. Sometimes small things matter more than big ones. She looked at him for a moment, then said, You sound like someone who's learned that the hard way. He smiled faintly. Maybe I have. After that day, he started visiting more often. At first, it was just to check on the hospital's progress. He said he wanted to see how his donation was helping. But each time, he would spend a little longer talking to her. Sometimes he brought lunch for the staff, sometimes books for the children's ward, sometimes flowers for the reception desk. He didn't act like a rich man when he came. He talked to everyone with respect, even the janitors. He would sit in the waiting area, drinking tea from a paper cup, chatting with patients like an ordinary person. It surprised everyone, especially the nurse. She had met many wealthy people in her life, but none of them were like him. One evening, she found him sitting in the garden behind the hospital, watching the sunset. She hesitated, then walked over. You like coming here, don't you? She asked. He looked up and smiled. It's peaceful. I like places that feel real. She sat beside him on the bench. The garden wasn't fancy, just a few flowers and an old tree. But the air smelled fresh and the sound of birds made it feel calm. You must have better places to be, she said. Why come to a small hospital like this? He looked thoughtful. Because here people care about each other. I've spent most of my life surrounded by people who only care about themselves. Here it's different, she nodded quietly. I guess we try our best. They talked for a long time that evening. He asked about her work, about her patients, about her father. She told him things she never shared with anyone. How hard it was to keep going some days, how she sometimes felt invisible, how she wished she could do more. He listened without interrupting, and for once she felt heard. When she finished, he said softly, "You have more strength than you think. People like you make the world better even if they don't realize it." She smiled shyly. "You make it sound easy," he shook his head. "It's not easy, but it's worth it." Over the next few weeks, their friendship grew naturally. He would call the hospital sometimes to ask how things were going, and she would update him. When he had free time, he stopped by to see her. The staff began teasing her gently, saying the rich man seemed to like her company more than the hospital's. She just laughed it off, pretending not to notice, but deep inside, she did notice. Every time he came, her heart beat a little faster. She told herself it was nothing, that she was just grateful for his kindness, but there was something more to it. She felt comfortable around him, something she hadn't felt in a long time. One evening, when she was leaving work, she found him waiting near the gate with an umbrella. "It's going to rain," he said with a smile. "Let me walk you home." She hesitated. "You don't have to. It's not far." "I know," he said gently, "but I want to." They walked together through the narrow street. The rain began to fall softly, and the umbrella barely covered them both. She could hear the sound of his footsteps beside her and smell the faint scent of rain on the air. "You must think I'm strange," he said suddenly. "Why would I think that?" "Because most people don't understand why someone like me would want to walk in the rain with someone like you." She stopped walking and looked at him. "Someone like me?" she asked quietly. He sighed. "I didn't mean it that way. I meant, you're different, real. You don't pretend." She looked down, her heart beating faster. "Maybe that's because I don't have anything to pretend about." He smiled softly. "That's exactly why I like being around you." They stood there in silence for a moment, the rain falling softly around them. Then he said, "Thank you for letting me be part of your world." She looked at him curiously. "You make it sound like we live in different worlds." He met her eyes. "Don't we?" She didn't know how to answer that. She knew there was a huge difference between their lives. He had everything, and she barely had enough to survive. But somehow, when they talked, those differences didn't seem to matter. When they reached her small apartment, she thanked him for the walk. He smiled and handed her the umbrella. "Keep it," he said. "I'll get another one." She laughed softly. "You really don't have to give me your umbrella." "I want to," he said simply. "Consider it a small favor in return for a sandwich." She smiled, remembering that rainy night. "I'd say we're more than even now." "Not yet," he said quietly. "But maybe someday." He left after that, but her heart stayed full of warmth. For the first time in years, she felt like someone truly saw her, not just as a nurse, not as someone struggling, but as a person. The next few days, she noticed herself smiling more. Her co-workers teased her again, and she tried to hide it, but she couldn't. She didn't know where things were going between them, but she didn't want to think too much about it. It was enough just to feel happy. One afternoon, a patient told her, "You have kind eyes, miss. You must be loved by someone special." The nurse blushed and shook her head. "I'm just doing my job," she said. But when she went home that evening, she found a small note taped to her door. It was simple, just a piece of paper folded neatly. She opened it and read, "Thank you for reminding me what kindness feels like. You've changed more than just my days. You've changed how I see life." There was no name, but she didn't need one. She knew exactly who it was from. She smiled to herself and held the note close. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it meant more to her than any gift ever could. That night, as she sat by her father's bedside, she told him about the man she had met, the stranger she once helped who kept showing up in unexpected ways. Her father listened quietly and smiled. "Sometimes," he said, "the people we help are the ones meant to change our lives." She looked at him and whispered, "Do you really think so?" "I know so," he said softly. "Goodness always finds its way back." She stayed awake long after he fell asleep, thinking about those words. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, she felt something close to hope. What she didn't know was that the man, sitting in his quiet apartment miles away, was thinking of her too. He looked at the city lights outside his window and smiled. For years, his world had been full of numbers, deals, and cold meetings. Now it felt alive again. He didn't know what name to give to what he was feeling. All he knew was that he wanted to see her again, not as a businessman, not as a donor, but as a man who finally understood what mattered most. And slowly, without either of them realizing it, kindness was turning into something deeper. It was a bright morning at the small hospital. The nurse had just finished her night shift and was about to grab a cup of tea when a sudden noise outside caught everyone's attention. A sleek black car had stopped at the entrance. It wasn't something the staff saw often in their quiet town. The car looked expensive, the kind that didn't belong in a place where people came to fix broken bones and pay bills in small notes. Everyone gathered near the window, whispering and wondering who it could be. Some thought it was a government official or a new donor. The nurse didn't pay much attention at first. She was too tired and just wanted her tea. But when the car door opened, she froze. A tall man stepped out dressed in an elegant suit. His hair was neatly brushed and he carried himself with quiet confidence. But it wasn't his clothes that made her heart skip. It was his face. She knew that face. The same eyes that had once looked at her with gratitude under a hospital porch. The same man she had given food to on that rainy night. Her cup almost slipped from her hand. For a moment, she couldn't move. The man she once thought was homeless was now standing there like someone important, maybe even powerful. The world around her seemed to pause. The hospital director rushed outside to greet him, clearly unaware of the connection between them. "Welcome, sir," the director said, shaking his hand warmly. "We didn't expect you today. How may we help you?" The man smiled politely. "I came to see someone," he said softly. His eyes scanned the crowd of nurses standing nearby until they stopped on her. The nurse lowered her gaze, still unsure how to react. He walked toward her slowly, each step measured and calm. The crowd watched in silence, wondering what was happening. When he stopped in front of her, he said gently, "It's good to see you again." The nurse blinked, still trying to understand what was going on. You're the man from that night," she said in disbelief. He nodded with a faint smile. "Yes, the one you helped when everyone else walked away." The other nurses looked at each other in confusion. The director frowned slightly, not knowing what to make of it. But before anyone could ask questions, the man turned back to the director and said, "I'd like to speak with her in private, if that's all right." They went to a small staff office near the back of the building. The room smelled faintly of medicine and coffee. The nurse sat down, still nervous, while he stood by the window for a moment, as if trying to find the right words. Finally, he turned toward her. "I owe you an apology," he began. "That night I wasn't completely honest about who I was." The nurse looked puzzled. "What do you mean?" He took a breath. "I'm not a poor man. I wasn't living on the streets. I just needed to step away from my life for a while, to see the world from a different side. I wanted to know how people truly treated others when there was nothing to gain." She stared at him, still trying to make sense of it all. "You mean you were pretending?" "In a way, yes," he said quietly. "But I didn't plan to meet you. That part wasn't pretend. You were kind to me when you didn't have to be. You gave me food, a blanket, and a reason to believe that real kindness still exists. That night changed me." The nurse didn't know what to say. Part of her felt surprised, another part uncertain. She had never imagined that the quiet man she helped could be someone so different from what he seemed. "I didn't help you expecting anything," she said softly. "You looked like you needed someone." "That's all?" He smiled, almost sadly. "That's exactly what makes it special. You helped without expecting anything. That kind of heart is rare." He reached into his coat pocket and handed her a small envelope. "This is for you," he said. She opened it slowly. Inside was a letter stating that her father's remaining medical bills had been fully paid, and a small note that read, "Thank you for saving more than just a stranger." Tears welled up in her eyes. "You didn't have to do this," she said, her voice trembling. "I wanted to," he replied gently. "When I left that night, I promised myself I'd come back one day, not to repay you, but to let you know your kindness didn't go unnoticed." The nurse wiped her eyes. "You really didn't need to do this for me. There are so many people who need help. I am helping others too," he said with a warm smile. "But you were the one who reminded me to start again. You made me believe that money should serve people, not rule them." A knock on the door interrupted them. The hospital director peeked in, looking nervous. "Sir, the local press wants to know if they can take a photo of your visit," he said politely. The man looked back at the nurse. Do you mind? She shook her head slowly. As long as they don't bother the patients. They both walked outside together. Reporters were already gathering near the entrance, curious about the man's sudden appearance. When one of them asked why he had come to such a small hospital, he smiled and said, "Because this place taught me something that no luxury ever could, that real care has no price." The crowd clapped softly. Cameras flashed, but the nurse quietly stepped aside, not wanting to be in the spotlight. She didn't see herself as a hero. She had only done what felt right. Later that afternoon, the man met the hospital staff in the main hall. He announced that his company would be donating a large sum to upgrade the hospital's equipment, build a small emergency ward, and improve staff salaries. The news spread quickly and joy filled the room. Some nurses cried with happiness. Others hugged each other, unable to believe it was real. The nurse stood at the back, her heart full but quiet. When he finished his speech, he looked across the room and met her eyes for a brief moment. There was a warmth there that words couldn't describe. After the event ended, he found her again near the old hallway where they first talked that morning. "I'll be leaving soon," he said. "But I'll come back." She smiled lightly. "You don't have to. You've already done enough." He shook his head. "It's not about doing enough. It's about staying connected to what matters." For a moment, silence filled the air between them. It wasn't awkward, just calm and full of meaning. Then he said softly, "You know, when I was sitting outside that night, I thought no one would even look at me. You not only looked, you saw me. That's something I'll never forget." The nurse felt her throat tighten. "I'm glad you're doing well now," she said. "I hope you keep finding people who make you believe in goodness." He smiled. "I already found one." She blushed slightly, unsure how to respond. He didn't say anything else. He just nodded, gave her a polite bow, and walked toward his car. The entire hospital stood outside as he drove away. For a while, everyone was talking about the generous tycoon who appeared out of nowhere. But for the nurse, the memory wasn't about the money or the donation. It was about a strange twist of fate, how a simple act of kindness had reached places she could never imagine. That night, as she sat by her father's bedside, she thought about everything that had happened. Her father asked her why she looked so thoughtful. She smiled and said, "Just thinking about how life surprises us sometimes." Her father nodded slowly. "It always does, especially when you do good without expecting anything back." She squeezed his hand gently. "You're right, Dad." The next morning, when she arrived at the hospital, a small bouquet of white lilies was waiting for her at the reception desk. There was a note attached. It read, "The world is a better place because of people like you. See you soon." Her heart skipped again. She smiled, quietly tucking the note into her pocket. The hospital went on with its usual rush, patients coming in, doctors moving quickly, and nurses hurrying through the halls. But for her, something had changed. There was a new lightness in her steps, a quiet happiness that stayed even in the busiest hours. Little did she know, this was not the last time she would see him. Something even more surprising was waiting, ahead, something that would change her life, forever. Several months had passed, since that unforgettable day when the man in the black car had returned to the small hospital. Life had slowly gone back to normal. The nurse was still working long hours, still comforting patients, and still carrying her calm smile wherever she went. But something inside her had changed. She now believed that kindness always found its way back. Maybe not immediately, but eventually. She had seen it happen with her own eyes. And though she didn't talk about it, there were quiet moments when she found herself wondering about him. The man who had once sat shivering outside her hospital and later stood in front of her, dressed like someone from another world. He had kept his promise to help. The new ward construction had already begun. The hospital looked livelier now, with better equipment and more hope in the air. Every time she walked past the new machines or the freshly painted walls, she thought about that day, and the look in his eyes when he said, "I'll come back." But months went by and he didn't. Sometimes, while sipping tea during her break, she'd glance outside, half expecting to see that familiar black car again, but it never came. She reminded herself not to get lost in thoughts. He had his own life, a big one, far from her small world. Maybe it was best that way. Then one evening, something unexpected happened. The hospital was buzzing with excitement because they were organizing a small celebration. The construction of the new ward had been completed, and the management planned to hold a simple ceremony to thank the donors and staff. The nurse was part of the organizing team, making sure everything was in order, from arranging chairs to decorating the hall with flowers. As the evening approached, the hall filled with guests, doctors, nurses, a few journalists, and townspeople who had come to see the new building. The director stood at the front, smiling proudly as he began his speech about the hospital's journey and the kindness of those who made it possible. Halfway through the speech, the director paused and looked toward the entrance. "And now," he said with excitement, "we welcome someone very special, a man whose generosity made all this possible." The nurse's heart suddenly raced. She didn't need to turn around to know who it was. The quiet sound of polished shoes approaching and the soft murmurs spreading through the crowd were enough. When she finally looked, there he was, walking through the doorway with that same calm grace, wearing a dark suit and holding a small bouquet of white lilies. Her breath caught for a moment. Everyone stood and clapped as he entered. He greeted the crowd politely, but his eyes searched only for her. When he found her standing near the back, their eyes met, and a faint smile crossed his face. The kind that said everything words couldn't. After the applause faded, he stepped forward to give a short speech. His voice was steady but filled with emotion. "Some months ago," he began, "I came here not as the man you see now, but as someone lost, not in wealth but in purpose. I was searching for something I didn't even understand. And in that search I met someone who reminded me that kindness still exists in the simplest forms." He glanced at her and everyone followed his gaze. The nurse felt her cheeks flush, but she didn't look away. "She didn't know who I was," he continued. "She didn't ask where I came from or what I owned. She just helped, with no hesitation, no judgment, and no expectation. That moment changed how I see the world." The hall fell silent. Every word he spoke carried weight, not just because of who he was, but because of how deeply he meant it. He finished his speech with a quiet smile and stepped down from the stage. The event continued for a while with light music and food, but the nurse barely noticed. Her heart was too full, her thoughts too loud. When the ceremony ended, most of the guests began leaving, chatting happily. She stayed behind to help clean up the hall. The night had grown calm, the faint scent of flowers still lingering in the air. Then she heard a familiar voice behind her. "You still work after everyone's gone?" She turned around. He was standing there holding the bouquet of lilies, the same kind he had sent her once before. She smiled gently. "Someone has to make sure everything's in order." He laughed softly. "You haven't changed at all, and you?" she asked, tilting her head slightly. "You seem different, happier." "I am," he said, "because I finally found something real." There was a short pause. Neither spoke for a moment. The sound of the evening breeze filled the silence. Then he took a small step closer. "I didn't just come here for the ceremony," he said quietly. "I came because I made a promise to myself the day I left this hospital. I told myself that if I ever found someone whose heart was pure, someone who made me believe in life again, I wouldn't let that person slip away." Her eyes softened, and her heart began to beat faster. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked, almost in a whisper. He smiled gently and held out the bouquet. "Because that person is you." She froze for a moment, trying to process his words. "You don't have to say that," she said softly. "You've already done so much." "I'm not saying it out of gratitude," he replied, his voice sincere. "I'm saying it because it's the truth. You helped me when I had nothing, and now I want to share everything I have, not to repay you, but to walk beside you." Her eyes filled with tears she couldn't hold back. "You don't even know what my world is like," she whispered. "It's small, simple, and full of struggles." He nodded slowly. "That's exactly why I want to be part of it. Because it's real. Because you taught me that happiness doesn't come from big houses or money. It comes from people who care." He reached into his coat pocket and took out a small velvet box. When he opened it, there was a simple ring inside, elegant but not flashy. "I'm not asking for an answer right away," he said softly, "but I want you to know how deeply I mean this. I want to build a life where kindness comes first, and I can't imagine doing that without you." The nurse stood still, tears slowly rolling down her cheeks. The world around her seemed to fade. For a moment, all she could hear was the sound of her heart beating and his steady voice. She finally smiled through her tears. "You're serious, aren't you?" He nodded. More than I've ever been about anything. She looked down at the ring, then back up at him. Her hands trembled slightly as she took a step closer. You know, she said quietly, that night when I saw you outside the hospital, I thought you were just someone lost in the rain. I never imagined this would happen. Neither did I, he said softly. But life has its own ways of bringing people together. She took a deep breath and nodded slowly. Then maybe we shouldn't question it. He smiled, his eyes lighting up. Is that a yes? She laughed gently through her tears. It's a maybe that feels a lot like yes. He slipped the ring onto her finger with trembling hands. The moment felt unreal, simple yet magical. No grand lights, no stage, no crowd. Just two people standing in a quiet hospital hall where it had all begun. The rest of the staff, who had been cleaning nearby, watched the scene unfold with teary eyes. A few clapped softly. Others whispered happily, amazed at what they were witnessing. That night, as they stood together under the soft glow of the hospital lights, everything felt complete. The nurse, who had once struggled to make ends meet, had found something money couldn't buy. Love that came from kindness. The man who had once doubted the world had found hope again in the heart of someone who expected nothing in return. They didn't rush into grand plans or lavish promises. Their story wasn't about wealth or fairy tales. It was about two souls who found each other through compassion. As they walked outside together, the air was cool and quiet. He looked at her and said softly, You know, that night you gave me food, I didn't just find warmth and I found my home. She smiled. And I guess I found mine tonight. The stars above shimmered faintly as if listening. And just like that, their story, which began with a small act of kindness Usain, became something far greater. A reminder to everyone who heard it that love often finds us when we're not looking and that sometimes the smallest gesture can change the course of two lives forever.